want to kind of take a step back and realize that with a few terms, I think I jumped the gun a little bit in terms of not explaining it well enough. So I really want to take a step back and talk about your ratings, share of ratings, as well as your HUT, PUT, and PER. So we've mentioned before in terms of ratings being this ideology for percentage-wise and understanding that this is a portion of the demographic universe that it is exposed to a specific medium, again, expressed as a percentage in the universe. HUT, PUT, and PER, on the other hand, is typically through usage of either television or radio. So HUT indicates households using television, PUT indicates people using television, and PER indicates people using radio. In the household, typically, if you're looking at things like Nielsen ratings, they actually calculate on a box to say how many people are watching at any given point in time. So again, this may be a notion of a selected group of people versus one person is viewing the content, and that's where we get the differentiation between PUT and PER, or excuse me, HUT and PUT, sorry. I typically don't use HUT all that much, and especially when we get into media share, we don't really calculate it too much. But again, for Nielsen ratings, this comes up quite a bit. So depending on what kind of data set you're using, it may be very valuable. But for, like I said, for this class, we don't use it that much. But share is going to be a major component of this in terms of it indicates the portion of television audience is a viewer of the program. And the biggest thing I want to kind of convey with that is this whole notion of how you kind of calculate it. And so when you're getting into your share, we start to say that ratings and things like PUT are very much beneficial in terms of how we're, again, analyzing our data here. And for ratings in particular, we know that it's kind of persons exposed to a vehicle, whereas PUT in the other case is number of people using a television at that period of time. So when we look at something like PUT, for instance, we could say something to the effect of when are people listening to the radio most often. So we know that there's a morning drive and an evening drive. We know that there's typically a big circulation for times that people are picking their children up from school. So anywhere from 3 to about 6 in the afternoon is usually a good time for radio. Or, your morning drive of anywhere from 7 to 9 a.m. This is why those morning shows are typically from 6 to 10 for the most part. They have a good 4-hour block that they're producing here. So that's kind of the set standard, although there's a really cool podcast that I really like to share with y'all. The first 30 minutes of it just talk kind of the beginning of podcasts. So it's really interesting, and even though they talk about a lot of hockey jargon, the first part of it is, again, specifically for kind of the nature and history of podcasts. But I'm getting a little off topic here. So, again, ratings, in this case, that's differentiating itself for PUT, goes from number of persons exposed to the vehicle. So remember, we're not talking about advertisements in themselves in terms of what's being viewed. We're looking at the channel that's being viewed. And with that, we can go through a Nielsen rating and see that this particular channel or this particular program is being watched at this segment. However, PUT looks at time. So you've got the what people are watching and where people are watching. And those are really cool together, but we also want to think about the share of that. Because, again, if you've got a primary block of time that people are listening to, however, the show is not indicative of your universe, typically that's not a good decision to place your advertisement. So what we do is we calculate share, which, if you look in your book, is ratings divided by PUT or PER. So depending on if you're viewing the television or you're listening to the radio, It's based on the people using television versus people using radio. Again, depending on what you're looking at. So ratings divided by PUT for TV or per for radio times 100. So that's a real easy formula to remember. Again, none of these are really that hard, but they are very beneficial, especially when you're trying to calculate those two areas of I want to find out the time period, the when, as well as the what in terms of what people are watching in terms of the vehicle. So I don't think I explained that all that well the first time around, so I just wanted to make sure I got to it today to make sure you're looking at that. If you've got any questions on things like GURPS, for instance, now's a good time to ask through those. I'll put a forum on there to talk about what you're kind of doing in this case, because this, again, is starting to look at campaigns versus actual one-time spots. This is the same with average frequency as well as reach in this case. So those are very important to remember, and trying to get those formulas in place, especially when you're doing the campaign, because typically we'll be looking at GURPS, for instance, which can be done in two different ways, as I mentioned in the last class. So when you get into your examples into your media flight plan, you'll discover two basic ways to calculate for your GURPS, whether it's through impressions or ratings. And typically it's easiest to when you are delivered one or the other, whether it be impressions or the rating itself. Ratings are pretty much the easiest ones you can do in terms of multiplying by how many spots you have based on the rating. You can calculate GURPS pretty easily, and again, the more GURPS you have, typically that's the best outlook for what you're trying to advertise in this case. Again, every single one of these things should be taken with a grain of salt. Don't just assume that this is the end-all be-all of what you should be striving towards. Again, they all have flaws. They all have calculations that can be misrepresented or calculated inaccurately to some regard. But and again, we've got to focus on James Potter in terms of what people are viewing, how people are viewing them, and again, does that take into any effect when it comes to calculating these these equations? Sorry, my brain just kind of dozed off there for a second. So again, those are your shares, those are your ratings. That's a little bit on GURPS. Let's talk about pricing. So one of the things that I'm going to have you do for this class is create a budget. And depending on the client, here in a few weeks, I'm going to assign you a budget that a client may particularly look at. And I'll kind of base this off of averages that I have. If you're doing a small business, I would probably recommend asking them, typically because the people who are doing small business know, at the very least, know someone if you're not working there. But please keep that into consideration. Please keep that in mind. And I'll make sure to mention that once we are starting to get a little closer to that. That should be after the midterm, is this notion of developing your budget. And so things like cost make a big difference in media planning because, again, we mentioned that metaphor of the party. You don't want to spend too much money on refreshments that you're not going to end up using. So, or you don't want to spend it in a way that, again, you're not going to be able to supply for the necessary tools that you want to use. So it's important to have that budget, but it's also important to determine that you're kind of bang for your buck. And that's where CPM and CPP come into play here. So CPM in this case is cost per 1,000. So it's not cost per million. A lot of people get that mixed up. So media planners tend to like the Roman numerals more than the actual acronym of it. So cost per 1,000 is what we're doing for CPM, whereas CPP is cost per point. And again, both evaluate kind of what's the best bang for your buck in terms of here's your GURPS or here's your impressions, and this is how much it costs to produce this. And each one of them has its merit. But it really just depends on what the agency that you're working for or who you're talking to is using. And like I said, this is kind of one of those things of when you're trying to calculate GURPS, whether it's ratings or impressions, either or is fine. It's just, what you're trying to use in this case, depending on what you have. So in this case, with cost per thousand, we're typically dealing with impressions. So on page 7, there's a good problem that they included, and I've drawn it up here on the board. So they mention with their cost and again, this is a calculation for cost per thousand. So in this case, they say there's 2 magazine spots. The together of those make up to be $45,000. Whereas they also talk about their radio, which is $10,000. So that is going to be our cost for both of these spots. So it's going to be $55,000 to work in radio, as well as these 2 magazine spots here. They mentioned that with the impressions, so they use gross impressions in this case, the magazines are worth 4 million impressions, and I think that's for the 2 of them. The radio is 2.5 million, so it's 4 million impressions, and then for radio it's 2.5 million, equaling 6.5 million impressions. So with that taken into consideration, the way we calculate for CPM is taking 55,000 divided by the 6.5 million times 100. And again, this is your gross impressions here. Sorry. And then we're moving towards the actual price. So total cost in dollars. And then we move to the actual formula times 100, and you get $8.46 for a CPM. So pretty good deal in this case. For this particular example, that's not a bad bang for your buck in terms of paying at $8.46 per impression. I know a lot of companies that pay a lot more than that. So it's just a good way to think about it. So if you're going in and saying that a particular magazine really works well, or a particular newspaper works well with my universe, you might want to calculate in there and say, again, how many impressions might you have, and how much is the cost on there. And the impressions can be a little hard to get, so you might want to just ask the paper or the magazine or whoever to be able to get that information a little bit more. So again, that's the hardest one to take a hold of. But if you have those numbers in terms of your impressions based on the media vehicle that's being produced, you can get a fairly accurate representation about how much it costs per that impression. So let's say you don't have impressions, which can obviously be a bit of a tricky spot. Let's say you only have GURPS. Let's say that the magazine provides the amount of GURPS that are provided within this magazine. So that's good. We're not going to use CPM if we're doing with GURPS. What we'll be doing is CPP, which is cost per point. I mentioned that again. And it's cost of 1 gross rating point, which is similar to CPM, but instead we use GURPS. So let's take a look at the formula. You'll notice again on page 7 that they actually ask you which is the better deal for using, in this case, $130,000 and the particular placement of ad, or excuse me, the GURPS in this case are 5, or is the better deal $118,000 for 4 GURPS. So the biggest thing is calculating that, and it's super easy. Once again, 130,000 divided by 5 GURPS is equal to 26,000 CPP. So 26,000 for the amount of money that you're getting out of here versus 118,000 for 29,500. Okay? So with this equation, what we're starting to get into is, again, we want to have a low cost per point. And so the book would mathematically say that the 5 rated GERP one, so that costs $130,000, would be the better bang for your buck. But again, let's back up a little bit and say, let's take it with a grain of salt. Let's not jump the gun and say that this is the end-all be-all of problems that we're doing here. Maybe you've got this, again, maybe this calculation says cost per point makes sense, but they're pretty close. So we may have to think about active audience and saying, yeah, this costs a little bit more. We might not get the amount of impressions that we want. However, we may have a more attentive audience. And so I like how Media Flight Plan will actually take that information and say, which one's better? And they're like, well, either would be fine. And again, they mentioned this notion of it's not always the best just based on the numbers. Because, again, you can have a magazine spot in ESPN, the magazine, for example, for a fishing lure or say something like that, versus a fishing-specific magazine. And your cost per point may be that ESPN makes the most sense in terms of the GERPs that are coming out of it, or in terms of the impressions that are coming out of it. However, if they're close, you might want to take the fishing magazine because you'll have a more attentive audience, even though the math doesn't add up as much for GERPs. Now, granted, I would imagine that ESPN would cost significantly more, but you'd probably have more impressions of GERPs. So those are major themes to think about. And you'll be using CPP and CPM in this class, probably briefly. I don't imagine we'll use it too much, but I do want us to try using them once we have those areas of impressions or GERPs that you can pull from. And again, it makes it just so much easier to allow yourself to bring that to light for your media plan. So if you have any questions about these, please let me know. I know, again, I'm throwing a lot of information at you, excuse me, for 1 week. However, if you have any questions about it, please let me know. I'll be happy to answer anything you got. And the good news is that this is the majority of the terms that we'll be using as we continuously progress throughout the course of this semester. So I think that's all. My brain is just shut off today. Full disclosure. I think that's it for today. If you have any questions, let me know. Like I said, I'm going to be posting a forum up online. And I hope you all have a great Wednesday. And I'll see if you have a lot of questions on the forum. I might make a video on Friday. Otherwise, just remember your competitive landscape with your primary and secondary competitors. So have a great week, y'all, and maybe I'll see you Friday. All right, take care. Bye.